Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalan Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Viktoriya Magid. For more than 15 years, Dr. Magid has been helping adults, adolescents, families, and couples to reach their full potential by guiding them past the barriers that are preventing them from living their most meaningful and authentic lives. Dr. Magid does the most to help her clients to heal deep wounds, change negative cycles, and meet their true values. So, welcome to the show so much. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for coming up with the idea for the podcast. I just want to say I think it's such a wonderful idea, just in general, to hear from a lot of different colleagues. I've heard some people on your podcast as well.
Thank you so much. I gave a bit of an introduction about who you are and what you do, but so that the audience can get to know you better, could you give us some background on yourself and your story?
Yeah, absolutely. My story, like the delivery of it, would vary. If you had asked me 10, 15 years ago, before I actually did the work on myself, it may have seemed like a very polished story, with like a happy beginning, happy middle, happy end, right? And I think some of my viewers will relate to this. The more work we do, the more we uncover about ourselves, the more we realize maybe there wasn't necessarily a happy beginning, or maybe there wasn't a happy middle. So I'm from Ukraine originally. I was born in southeast of Ukraine, where there's actually a lot of fighting that's going on right now, and that's a whole separate podcast. But I have been raising money over the past year quite a bit for some of my friends who are fighting on the front lines. So I'm still deeply connected with my roots. I lived in Ukraine till I was 18, and then moved to the United States. I lived in New York for a little bit, and decided to go to graduate school in Buffalo, New York. So I did my college training and grad school in Buffalo. And then I met my husband in grad school. We got married. Like I said, everything kind of looked good. And, until I started sort of having some marital difficulties, things weren't kind of, very copacetic. And of course, back in the day, I was blaming my husband. Maybe again, some viewers can relate. It's like, well, can't be me. I mean, I'm a therapist. I'm a psychologist. I had a PhD by then, right? For those of us who have PhDs, we're very, very healthy. And I, just blamed my husband, blamed the environment, blamed the stress, blamed, whatever the case may be, until I really kind of started to realize that I needed to take a look at, myself. And this maybe was about 10, 15 years ago now. I started to sort of peel my own layers, which is very uncomfortable work, my friends. I was helping my clients peel those layers for years. Now, when it came to me doing that work, it's like, oh, this is hard work. So I'm one of you guys. I empathize with the work that you do, right? So all roads, make long story short, all roads sort of started to point towards my childhood. And I was one of those people who believed that childhood happens in the past. And it wasn't actively haunting me necessarily. So I never had what we would call sort of true post-traumatic stress disorder. I never really had re-experiencing. I've never had nightmares. I never had any of those kind of classic symptoms of PTSD. So I knew my childhood wasn't perfect, but I said, well, it couldn't have affected me really because I don't have PTSD. In graduate school, they teach you the criteria in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and I really wasn't quite meeting the criteria. So I just kind of said, well, I'm sure that's fine. I've moved on. I don't think about it anymore. Wrong. And so the more work I did, I initially started my career in addictions. It's kind of where my interest lied. A lot of my friends back in Ukraine developed addictions, and alcoholism sort of rampant in the culture there. So I studied addictions, but the more I studied addictions, the more I realized that that's just the tip of the iceberg. And it is just an unhealthy coping mechanism with what's sort of underneath, you know. And what's underneath a lot of times is the same for many of us, you know. And even though I personally never struggled with addiction per se, although I did use alcohol as a coping tool for a while as well, and I had to kind of face that. That underneath piece was, you know, my childhood trauma. And I had to face that. I had to realize in all the ways that it's affected me, and all the ways that it was affecting my reactions to my husband, my relationships, even my parenting. Was being affected without me really even being aware of that or being conscious of that. And so when all that kind of came crushing down, you know, I did a lot of work. I did, you know, inner child work, and sort of got into Buddhist meditation, and, you know, did a lot of sort of self-exploration. I now, probably in the past 5-7 years of my life, have really dedicated my work and my career in helping my clients uncover some of the things that I ended up uncovering about myself. Really just becoming conscious about your patterns.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the relatability and being able to, you know, be willing to share, because a lot of us, like you said, we don't think of, you know, therapists or people with a PhD as someone who may not be, you know, completely healthy emotionally. So to be able for you to have all these accolades and to be a therapist, et cetera, and to show that, you know, you're no different than any one of us,
Yep.
that does a lot. It does do a lot.
Yeah. I wasn't, you know, believe me, if you asked me 10 years ago, I'd be very defensive, very closed about it, right? But because I was able to integrate these parts of myself and develop compassion for these parts of myself, I can now speak without shame about myself.
That's the key. That's the key. Thank you, Dr. Magic.
Mm-hmm.
And I got it wrong when I said it earlier.
You're
I
fine.
tried 100 times to get it right, but anyway,
You're fine.
I wanted to correct that. So thank you for sharing your story. I wanted to kind of get into the interview a little bit, the meat and potatoes of it, so to speak, because I know that the questions that are prepared, you can do a really good job of answering based on your expertise and your knowledge. So the first question that I wanted to ask is, what are some reasons someone might feel guilty about getting their needs met? And I think that may stem from childhood too. So I'm glad that you touched on that.
Wow. Yes. You know, it's such a pervasive issue, really, that I see in my work with clients. And oddly enough, I myself was that way, even though I always saw myself as a pretty assertive person. In fact, you would think that, oh, she doesn't have any trouble getting her needs met because I was assertive and I could communicate, but I really did never communicated in vulnerable ways about my actual needs, you know.
Mm.
So you're right. We, as human beings, we start to learn, and our brain undergoes the largest developmental leap, sort of somewhere between the ages of 0 and 6. You know, some say it's, you know, 0 and 12, right? But that's kind of where the bulk of your belief systems, values, and cognitions will be developed. And that is why it's so important to look to childhood to understand where some of these tendencies might be coming from, right? And then if your childhood you know, if you have that fertile ground, and then our culture sometimes reinforces some of these beliefs, well, then we're really SOL, right? So, you know, speaking of needs, right? If a child, if you, I did, if you grew up in a family with parents who were, for whatever reason, not able to help you prioritize your needs. So that could look like a parent who maybe is not very emotionally mature themselves. Maybe they're struggling with an addiction. Maybe they're struggling with mental health issues. Maybe it's not necessarily obvious that they're struggling with mental health issues, right? Because remember, our parents, and that's partly what helped me also forgive my parents. Mental health was not as readily available to that generation, right? So yes, I've been to therapy, and a part of me wants to say, well, my mother should have gone to therapy and she should have figured it out too, and why did I have to suffer because she didn't figure it out, or my father, for that matter, didn't figure it out? And then I try to remind myself that they were born in the 50s. Um, Extremely different culture. Now, they were born in the Soviet Union, but we can probably both agree that regardless of United States, Soviet Union, therapy just wasn't something that people did in the 70s or 80s, right? Um, it's we're lucky. I consider myself very lucky and fortunate to be having conversations like you and I are having right now. So many people suffered, right? They suffered from stress. They suffered from their own trauma. They suffered maybe from mental health and addiction issues. And when you have a child who is being raised by a parent who themselves have a lot of needs that they're not able to meet successfully, whether it's because of their mental health issue, immaturity, or just environment is very challenging. Maybe they are a single working parent who are working two jobs, right? And just kind of doing their best. The child very quickly will develop a belief, well, my needs don't have to matter. My needs don't matter, because a child will always want to prioritize a connection with their caretaker over and above anything else, because that connection with the caretaker means survival. Okay, that means, if my parent likes me, I'm probably going to be okay physically, at least. Okay. Because back in the day, remember, we need to look at ourselves from an evolutionary standpoint, right? Back in the day, where we used to live in tribes and we used to have many, many children. If you have a child that's kind of like, nah, you're not really useful, nah, I don't like you so much, who knows? That child might not really make it if you have 20 other kids, right? Just kind of like in an animal kingdom, right? So, some puppies don't make it, right? Right. And so deep down, we may not be aware of this, but we are wired for that survival, and we're wired for that attachment with the primary caretaker. So if I come to my primary caretaker with my needs, maybe they're unspoken needs because I'm a baby and all I really need is, want to be held, or I want to be, snuggled, cuddled. We don't just have physical needs as human beings. We have emotional needs, we have psychological needs, we have that need for attachment, right? And my parent is overwhelmed, right? My parent is struggling, or my parent is drunk, or my parent is depressed, or maybe the parent is not educated that a child could have those needs, and instead they're interpreting it like a child's being manipulative. Okay, that was a very prominent parenting theme of the 80s and the 90s, right? That, like, the cry it out method. I mean, even still to this day, right? Oh, they're just manipulating you. If you're going to pick them up every time they cry, they're going to wrap themselves around, all this nonsense, right? And even a well-meaning, sometimes my clients say, well, I didn't really have a traumatic childhood. Like, my parents seems like fine. I said, it doesn't have to be a trauma the way that you view trauma necessarily. It could just be a parent who read the wrong parenting book. And now you're crying, and maybe you're scared, and maybe you need to know your caretaker there, but you're not getting picked up on a regular basis, right? I mean, if it happens once or twice, I don't want parents to freak out at home, trust me, But we're shooting for like 75% rate. If 75-80% of the time you are responsive to your children's needs, they will not develop these negative core beliefs. But if 75-80% of the time the child is consistently realizing, for any of these reasons above, that my needs don't really matter, and when I push for my needs to be met, my caretaker gets angry or gets frustrated with me, or just sort of detaches and ignores me, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to stop needing. I'm going to stop advocating on my behalf so that I can maintain this connection with the caretaker, so that I can be a good girl or a good boy in their eyes, right? And so, of course, we grow up and the parent is left in the past, and all that is left in the past, but these deeply wired beliefs remain, right? So when I would go to ask my husband to go to yoga early in my healing journey, because I realized yoga helps me and sort of, helps me heal and helps replenish me, I felt horribly guilty. Horribly guilty. You know, and when you're not conscious and not aware, you want to blame the other person for that feeling, you know? So I used to say to him, well, you don't give me room for my needs, even though I didn't ask and he didn't even know what they were. You know?
Right.
I said, well, it's because, you know, you're always working and then after work you go to the gym and, you know, when am I supposed to go to yoga? There's no time. Excuses, right? Excuses with my own guilt. And then, you know, after some years of reflection, I said to myself and realized, wow, when he used to tell me, listen, just make a time and go, he meant it. He wasn't playing around, you know, he didn't mind for my needs to be met. So that's just sort of an example of how that plays out. And then in adult life, we can feel a lot of guilt asking for our needs to be met. And depending on our level of awareness, we either blame other people for our own needs not being met, or we just sort of suffer in silence, right? I mean, neither is really a very healthy approach, right? So it's, again, rewiring your brain, recognizing, okay, this is where this tendency is coming from. So it doesn't mean anything bad about me. It's okay that I struggle getting my needs met. At the same time, I need to push past that discomfort. I need to push past the guilt, right? I need to regulate and calm my body and advocate on my behalf. And hopefully, if you are with the right people and the right partner, your needs actually will be met, because this is a different environment than it was while you were growing up.
Wow. That was very, very detail oriented in your explanation. And as far back as childhood, maybe not even being picked up can wire you to be a certain way that shows up in adulthood. That's very deep.
That'll
Wow.
give a lot of new parents anxiety. Sorry. But again, we're just shooting for that, 70-80% of the time. Nobody's perfect. It's okay to let your kid cry sometimes, as long as, generally speaking, they believe that you're there for them. And those times when they're not picked up are exceptions. If they know that's an exception, and you could even say to them, okay, I'll be there in 5 minutes, so they know that you will respond eventually, right? Then that's still fine. I'm talking about really kind of when that predominant chronic sense of not feeling cared for.
So if being a child could wire your brain to feel like your needs aren't important, could that also um, be some reasons why some are afraid of confrontation?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Right. So we can kind of take a similar scenario, and let's say, you're being raised by, we'll just use a father here for just to switch things up so there's not just mom guilt. you know But, so let's say that you're being raised by a dad who himself had some childhood trauma, right? Who himself may have been yelled at as a kid and may have even been called, stupid or an idiot or, God knows what. So then he's raising, this girl or boy. And, you know, a child, again, needs to have that sense of safety, sense of security, that I can speak up and still maintain a connection with my parent. For those of you guys who do have children between the ages of 0 and, say 15 or so, that's key. I can speak up and still maintain that connection. It doesn't mean that you have to do what they're asking you to do. It doesn't mean that you have to be a pushover parent, right? But we don't punish emotionally, right? So let's say this boy or girl comes to this dad who has his own childhood trauma, who has these ideas of what respect is and all these kind of toxic cultural ideas of what a father means in the family, right? And say this little boy or girl says, well, I don't want to do my homework today, said every other child in the universe, right? And let's say that dad gets triggered, right? Because to him, that means disrespect. His own trauma might come up from his own childhood or some cultural beliefs. And so instead of empathizing and saying, well, gee, I get it. Homework's not that fun. It's not fun, but, we kind of have to do it because, you're going to get a 0 and then Miss Webster's going to be mad at you. And then, no, don't you want to finish high school? It's sort of this unitarian approach where, how dare you speak to me like this? What is wrong with you? You sit down better, young man, young woman, and you da-da-da-da-da. And sort of this idea that something is wrong with you for speaking up. Something is wrong with you for disagreeing with me. And some of our viewers who are our age, I'm sure, can imagine their parents getting kind of scary in those moments, right? Or if you made a mistake, a parent can get really scary. And in our psych world, we call it dysregulated, right? Where your emotions become kind of out of control and almost disproportionate to sort of what caused it. So imagine that happens on somewhat of a chronic basis. We can pretty easily imagine how that little boy or girl would be terrified of confrontation, right? Because confrontation to me now means a few things, right? Number one, it means it's probably not going to end well. I should not speak up. I should not disagree. I should not put my opinion there because it's going to get bad. It's going to get ugly and scary. Again, much of it is not happening on the conscious level. Just again, want to clarify, and that's why it's so insidious and can be really difficult to work on, is because most people aren't actually thinking that. They're just feeling in their body this terror. It's just a feeling, and then just avoid it unconsciously. And that's really what therapy does, is elucidating as to why do you feel this way, right? And then once you can get your head wrapped around the why, you can then work on the how to change that, right? So my body, I may have even forgotten those memories. I might start to remember my father as like the good old jolly fella, because that's what's convenient for me to remember him as, right? And you kind of forget some of those like, ooh, scary moments. And yet, when comes time to advocate for my raise at work or disagree with a colleague on how, he might be handling a case, I get terrified. I had a client who tells me, she's like, Dr. Magid, I feel like I'm a 12-year-old kid. I don't get it. I know I have the credentials. I know I have the experience, but I'm so terrified of confrontation. I feel like I'm a little child, And that's exactly what happens, right? So we feel, your brain, your amygdala always remembers. It's always going to want to protect you from situations that are similar to the terror you experienced as a child. Always and forever, unless you work actively on it. So your memory may have faded, but your physiology remembers, right? Because we're wired to survive. So a child with that kind of upbringing where he or she was yelled at, or the parent would get dysregulated when the child just voiced their disagreement or their opinion, and they would absolutely be afraid of confrontation, just even on the physical level. It would just give them a panic attack, and they wouldn't even know why. And sometimes they might say, "Well, I'm so shy," right? Or, "Well, I'm just afraid of authority," right? Or, "Well, I'm just introverted," and not necessarily so, right? These could just be trauma reactions.
Wow. I think the way you described it and then the example that you gave of your client who says that she feels like she's a 12-year-old in that moment, and then also to say, maybe I'm just shy. No, you're not shy. You have a terror that is stuck in your body, and when you're in that moment that's similar, your brain is trying to protect you. Wow.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That was a great explanation. Thank you for that. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's say someone struggles with dishonesty. Could that also be tied into some of the things that you talked about? Like, what could the root cause of that be?
Oh my, we're just going to explore all the issues. Okay, I love it. Yes, right? Yes. Again, for those of you guys who are watching right now, if you have a pervasive tendency that shows up in various situations, almost to a point where it doesn't quite make sense, take a look at your childhood. Maybe I'll have a space to give an example of my own as well here too. But so yes, so what is defensiveness, right? So defensiveness has several causes. One, it could be a learned behavior. Now, another piece here is that children also learn vicariously through their parents. Okay, not only do they adapt, to their environment, but they're also learning from their environment. So if you have a parent who was highly defensive around you, or you witnessed your two parents being highly defensive around one another, there's a really good chance that you're going to take that as a tool. Okay? So we're just learning tools from our parents. And that can be really tricky, because I have a lot of clients coming in and be like, I really don't want to be like my parent. You know, they were like, it really messed me up. It was horrible. And I hate myself for being like them. And it's kind of like saying, well, I mean, it's like hating yourself for speaking English, even though you were born into like an English speaking family. Like, you know, of course you're going to have those tendencies. So again, self-compassion, self-forgiveness, right? Of course you're going to have those tendencies. So that's one way that we could learn defensiveness. Another way that we could learn defensiveness is, again, it starts with hypercriticism. So if you have a hypercritical parent who would nitpick and point out all the mistakes that you've made, you know, and maybe overreact. Oh, did you spilled the milk on the carpet? But that's a new carpet. And we just bought it. Jeez, nothing holds up in this house with you. This is ridiculous. Now go sit down and get a broom. And she's like, oh my gosh. Again, you know, this is sort of an example of nothing traumatic's really kind of happening. I'm not, you know, beating the child necessarily, but I feel unsafe all of a sudden, right? And this feeling of a lack of safety is kind of almost disproportionate to what I had done. You know, I couldn't have controlled it. I spilled the milk. It was just an honest mistake, right? So you have this hypercritical parent. Then a curious thing happens when we start to mature. For some people, around the age of like 11, 12, 13, somewhere around that time, if your child, or later becomes your inner child as we get older, right? But if your inner child's been wounded repeatedly like this, we may end up developing another part to our psyche. And that's, you know, your not your ordinary parts is the name of your podcast, right? So that kind of just speaks, you know, directly to it. And that's actually not a new, I mean, that, you know, Carl Jung sort of developed this idea of different parts of the self and, you know, all of their purposes. So because the child has been wounded repeatedly and treated unfairly, chronically for so many years, a person may end up developing another part to their psyche that would call the protector. You know, different treatments call it different. You know, I kind of just call it the protector for lack of a better word. And the protector has only one goal: to not allow the child feel the vulnerable emotions of shame, of guilt, of anxiety that he or she chronically felt for the first 7, 8, 9, 10 years of their life. So then the protector, or the defender, is going to get really defensive. That's also the part of you that lies, okay? Because we lie to protect us from feeling shame. Because deep down, you feel like just such a rotten little boy. Not really, right? That's what I always tell my clients. I'm like, oh, that wasn't learned. You know, you were always good. You know, you were always good. But because the messages between the ages of 0 and 10 is that you kind of are a rotten little boy or girl. Nobody might say those words directly, but just hypercriticism, a lack of maybe love and affection, right? All kind of creates the sense that maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe I'm not being, you know, lovable. The protector or the defender comes in, and then anytime your psyche perceives potential threat, like similar to what used to be going on when you were little, the defender immediately comes in. Okay, so to give a quick example, I have a client whose father used to call him an idiot a lot. I mean, clearly he has had his own issues, his own trauma, right? He's like, you're just such an idiot. You moron. You're retarded. Why are you doing this? You're such a retarded kid, you know. So he developed this highly defensive part to himself, and he came in a couple of days ago, and he's now working on himself. He gave me a sort of funny example. He goes, you know, I was just at work, and someone said, hey, I'll call him, you know, Bobby. Hey, Bobby, have you read this book? I mean, it just came out. Like, it was really good, you know. The person didn't offend, didn't say anything mean. But to him, he took it, he didn't read the book, obviously, right? And so he took it like, oh no, they're going to reveal how dumb I really am, right? Because that's a trigger. Being called retarded, being called stupid, right, is all sitting in there. So this coworker's like, oh, I read this great book. Have you read it? And immediately he comes out with, I haven't read it. I'm sure it was stupid, you know? I mean, but I was reading Plato a couple weeks ago, and have you read that? And the guy's like, gee, man, like, chill. I don't mean no disrespect. I mean, that was just, And so, speaking about being defensive, sometimes it's a little more apropos, sometimes not. But again, that protector is going to be scanning the environment for any possible threat to the pain that you underwent, prior to when the protector was developed, and it's going to be defensive. So if you are someone who is highly defensive, chances are you have some unresolved trauma in your childhood. That's kind of how it works, And we need to have compassion. I'll just say this last thing. I know I can sometimes be a little wordy, but we need to have compassion for the defender too. Right? So a lot of my clients will say, I just wish I wasn't so defensive. I just hate that part of myself. And I will say, no, that part of you was born because it was trying to protect you. It was born out of your own pain. And maybe if not for that part, you'd be even worse off. I don't know. If you couldn't protect yourself at all, maybe you would have just ended up straight in a mental institution at the age of 12. So that's how we try to have compassion for ourselves no matter what our behavior is.
It's funny how we look at those parts and we automatically, may tend to do it with a negative eye, or we may think they're bad. But if we look at what the part has been trying to do and the protection that is provided, we can kind of step back from how we feel about it and see that it was only doing its job. And then we can look at it and say, wow, thank you. Thank you for protecting me or trying to protect me.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I may not need you as much anymore, but thank you for showing up for me at the time of need.
Right. Exactly. So what would be some ways that someone could develop tools or methods if they struggle with feelings of inadequacy? What are some things they could do to work on that?
Yeah, well, that's like $1 million question right there, right? The key here, it's all, if we really look at it as kind of like a journey, it all will sort of start to line up, right? The very, very first step is to understand the origin. And I cannot express how important that is and how many therapies are lacking that. Unfortunately, I was trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is wonderful. But as some of you who's either been a patient, a client, or you deliver it, you know that it can sometimes be a little superficial. The manualized treatments can be a bit superficial. They teach you the skills, but they're not really getting at the root cause. And getting at the root cause is so important for your own self-compassion. Because no matter what the skills that you learn, right? I can teach my clients, diaphragmatic breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, self-care, exercise, meditate, go to yoga, have a healthy social circle, use affirmations every day, right? I mean, there's infinite number of, tools that can kind of aid us on the healing journey. But if the client did not grasp the idea that they were never bad to begin with, they will always feel like they're faking it. They will always feel like they're just trying to superficially convince themselves that they're not bad, but they really are. And their loving therapist is just giving them some band-aids to, prevent them from slipping into some horrible depressive episode, which they'll have to be hospitalized from, right? And we're just kind of managing. Trying to prevent that panic attack, trying to prevent that real severe bout of depression. We're just kind of managing. And my goals for my clients is to really grasp the idea that they were born good. They were already good at birth. Like my worth at birth is no more than your worth at birth, right? Wouldn't you agree? Like if you look at us, as babies, and here we are, I opened my eyes, Jalen opened his eyes, whoever else, right? You're not going to look like, well, yeah, I mean, he's a much better baby than that woman over there. Like, that's just silly. Like we're laughing, right? But yet, depending on our upbringing and what we learned from our immediate environment, which is our family, and then our environment at large, right? And I mean, things like racism come into place. There's a lot of kind of complex pieces to our culture, right? It starts here, our family, how we're treated, but then it will potentially compound that, right? We are going to have an idea of differential worth. But that's just an idea, right? We were born the same exact way. And that's why I'm also so passionate about telling my story to my clients so that they really believe that I was fucked up too, and they might say, oh, you have a PhD and you must be so smart and you speak all these languages and da-da-da-da-da. It doesn't matter. It doesn't add to my worth. My worth is the same as your worth, right? It's like looking at two puppies and saying, well, this puppy is worthy and this one is not. It doesn't make any sense. We don't do that in the animal world. We're not saying, well, the life of this horse is more valuable than the life of this zebra. I mean, that wouldn't make no sense, right? But as humans, we internalize these beliefs. So I can't emphasize how important that part is, the self-exploration part, understanding why do I have these tendencies, and then having compassion for the tendencies as well as for coping strategies with the tendencies, whether it be being highly defensive, whether it even be a little manipulative sometimes. A lot of times that's just a coping strategy because your parent didn't really hear you. They wouldn't just take your word. You had to figure out how to get your needs met like this, right? So you became a bit manipulative. That word has such a horrible, right? Oh, red flag. But, and I'm not saying you have to live with someone who is manipulative. Like that's boundaries, right? Maybe if the person's not healthy, that's boundaries. But in and of itself, it's just an adaptation. Addiction, it's just an adaptation. So I would say for all my clients, you can read about tools. I'm a big proponent of meditation and mindfulness and self-care and healthy boundaries and healthy social circle. But before you do any of that, do with either a therapist or self-guided exploration of what your childhood and early culture taught you about you. Okay? And how did you cope with that? And then forgive yourself and have compassion for yourself around that. And that's really are the seeds of sort of self-love. Like that's true self-love,
I think that you tied everything together, whether it be struggling to get your needs met or being hyper defensive or being dishonest or, all the things. I think they all may stem from, like you mentioned, that root of your childhood if there were some issues there.
Yeah, absolutely. And but also a culture at large, right? So
Correct.
If you have sort of this family where you struggle to get your needs met, but then in our culture of overworking, overachieving, there is kind of an onus placed on getting your needs met is selfish. You shouldn't. We wear our busyness as like a badge of honor. Oh, I can't do. I'm so busy. Oh, I worked so much. Oh, I can't get through my emails. They're so. It's like a good thing somehow.
Right,
or like I haven't taken vacation in 3 years. Like okay, So we
so
also
true.
kind of live in this kind of Western. No other world does it that way, right? But we live in this Western culture that's actually not conducive to mental health. So if you're sort of exploring your childhood and you're thinking, well, I don't know, I'm not seeing really any kind of messages there, take a look at your culture. Take a look at what messages you were learning as a young woman or as a young man. What's considered good, and what is rewarded in our culture. And especially if it matches your family upbringing, that's going to be really a double whammy right there.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's say someone is um, taking advantage of the tools that are mentioned, and they're learning how to get curious about their culture, their childhood, and they start to say, you know what, I want to have some compassion on myself. I want to be um, more forgiving to the way I was brought up, because now I see that it wasn't maybe necessarily what I thought it was, or if it was, there's a reason,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So now they begin to have self compassion. That could be a slippery slope, because
Mm-hmm.
if we aren't healthy yet, we may not know the difference between authentic self love and toxic positivity.
Mm-hmm.
So that I wanted to ask you, what's the difference between the two of those?
Yeah, wow, that's actually also just such a great question. And I think, our culture likes to kind of grab onto ideas and sometimes simplify them and run away with them. Um, so there's definitely been some sort of like, some call it spiritual bypassing too, right? Or sort of this toxic positivity where you sort of simplify things and you, you know, I tell my clients that, believing that you're worthless and believing that you're the best human in the world, they're both toxic and wrong. you know and that's, again, if somebody doesn't quite kind of understand that we all have the same worth, but that also makes us fallible, that makes us subjects to mistakes. I've hurt people in my past, you know, and because I now can have true self compassion and true self love, I don't look at it from sort of a toxic positivity stance, which would just be sort of bypassing all the crap that's there, you know, and, toxic positivity could look like I'm not really honoring somebody's struggle, right? And just saying,
Mm,
oh, you know, I'm in therapy now, and my therapist says you got to stay positive. That's usually not exactly what they mean, right? Any therapist
right.
will tell you you got to honor all your feelings. All your feelings are there for a reason. But, if you misunderstood, or if you're just reading a book or something superficial, you might say, oh, don't be such a Debbie Downer, you know. Don't be such a Debbie Downer. It's all good. It's all right, Even in my social circle, sometimes if somebody's struggling, the other women are like, oh, she's just, so difficult to be around, and she's just always a Debbie Downer. It's like, oh no, she's being authentic. She's being authentic. She's going through a lot, right? So it's sort of very
Mm,
different. This kind of an example of toxic positivity is twofold. A, expecting people to show up positively no matter what, kind of disowning a range of emotions, disowning their feelings, right? Which is, we do learn that a lot of times from our family, but then it's very much reinforced by our culture. And we mistaken mental health for positivity. Being mentally healthy does not mean being positive.
thank you for that.
Just looking, and I was like, oh no, not at all. That does not mean that the glass is always fuller. That means the glass is always real.
Right.
you
Oh,
know
wow.
it means being able to call a spade a spade. It means to be able to say, if I'm struggling, I am struggling, I am overwhelmed today because yesterday I had something, today I have something, and tomorrow my kids have 4 birthday parties. I am overwhelmed. Does that mean I'm struggling mentally? Not really, because this is a completely normal human process, right? That we don't allow ourselves that. We don't, because we're afraid. And we're afraid that if that facade falls away, all that's going to come up that we really haven't processed for years, right? So toxic positivity is denying other people their genuine, varied, true emotions, right? And denying yourself genuine, varied, true emotions. Kind of like if you're if you're struggling with something, toxic positivity would be to look at yourself in the mirror and just, you're beautiful, you're smart, you got this. And in reality, your inner child is freaking out. And your inner child is like, no, I don't got this. Because this very much triggers me. And this reminds me how my mother used to scream at me, and I don't got this at all. So authentic self-love is really allowing yourself to have all the human feelings. These feelings are here for a reason. We have evolved to have anxiety. We have evolved to have sadness and fear and guilt and grief and all the spectrum. If those emotions were not useful, believe me, we wouldn't have them anymore. Evolution would have taken care of it, millions of years ago. We would just be, happy all the time, but we're not, and the only thing that's wrong with difficult feelings, or I don't call them negative feelings, I just call them maybe sometimes challenging feelings, or, different feelings, or whatever the case may be. The only thing that's wrong with them is somehow our culture somewhere down the road decided that they're bad. And then now when I feel this way, I judge myself, or I judge other people for having them, In reality, acceptance, and self-compassion, and understanding that, hey, your therapist has those feelings too, right? If we're honest, and the more honest we become as a culture, the easier it's going to be to accept that, because you will start to realize that it's completely normal. I have the privilege of getting inside the brains of, hundreds of people. So I know this to be true, and I read research but some folks who, aren't in my field, they may truly believe that what the culture is trying to put out there, kind of the Instagram of life, right? That's reality, and that everybody's just happy all the time. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I'm going to start, I had the idea, now I'm going to start posting some pictures, or start some kind of a channel, Instagram, like my real life, and like snap the picture before the picture kind of thing, and show how my kids were actually hitting each other on the head right before I took this other picture, because we're ashamed to let each other know that we're struggling, but there's nothing more real and more normal about our human experience.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you for
Thank you.
explaining it the way you did, and for also, you said it, call a spade, just be honest. I think the honesty stems back to, the things that we talk about, our culture, our childhood. If we couldn't be honest as a child, if we couldn't be honest in our family system, then that it just bleeds over into everything.
Yeah. Well, I think you're exactly right. I think our honesty as a child likely would trigger our parent who did not yet process their trauma, right? So what would happen as a child, many of you probably attempted to be honest at some point. You may not even remember that, but probably at some point you would say, like, Mommy, you're hurting me, or, Daddy, I wish you didn't drink so much, or guys, I wish you didn't argue, or I'm scared when you leave me, right? So a child up until a certain point attempts to be honest. But when that honesty is not received, the child is not being seen, the child is not being appreciated for what they're bringing to the table. A lot of times, not because the parent is a bad, right, or like a bad person. They just can't handle it. Like we talked about, guilt and shame, right? If you have unprocessed stuff from your own life, my child criticizing me is not going to land well. My defender is going to come in, okay? And my child will meet my defender instead. And I'm going to say to my child, how dare you say this to me? You should be grateful. I worked 2 jobs to put the food on the table, and if it wasn't for me, you would go barefoot to school. How dare you tell me that I shouldn't be drinking? Or how dare you? I talk to your mother the way I want to talk to your mother, okay? Who the hell are you? Whatever. Maybe some name calling will come on board, right? And so the child will quickly learn it actually doesn't pay at all to be honest. It doesn't pay at all to be authentic. I better off shove it, stuff it, somehow sublimate it. Later down the road, may cope with drinking or drug use or whatever, because these feelings, they don't go anywhere. It's not like you decided to not be angry and the anger truly leaves your body and like never comes back. Like it doesn't work like that, you know? All these unprocessed feelings that just get stuffed and stuffed and stuffed. And then later you get so angry that you either start fighting or you start womanizing or you start drinking or drugging or whatever the case may be, or gambling, because you need another tool to keep the lid on. And a lot of times when I used to work a lot with addiction, when folks get sober for the first time, they expect, God bless them, that things immediately will get better and that their life will get better, and their lives usually get more difficult and harder because all these feelings start to come out. We're like, oh my God, I'm so resentful, oh my God, I'm so angry. But except with your average person, somebody who's accepted their feelings, the anger might last a couple hours or a couple days and it will fade. If you've been stuffing for the 30-40 years, you feel angry for months. It just needs so much time to process. So a lot of times people will get discouraged and they'll relapse, right? So for those of you guys who are either needing to be in recovery or are in recovery, I see you and I honor your journey. And it's a hard one. It's a hard one, but it does get better, right? These feelings will start to sort themselves out, and then you start to be able to regulate yourself as you use your tools, and it does get better. But that's just an example of what ends up happening in our culture.
Your honesty and your energy is fantastic because I mean you tell it just like it is. There's no holds barred. Um, why pretend? Why pretend? And I think that
Right.
that may stem from you, doing your own work, like you said earlier.
I have done the work, and I've done things, I've looked at things that I was ashamed of, you know. I used to, when I share it with my clients, they don't believe me, but I'm like, I used to scream at my husband. I mean, I used to throw things at him. That's the truth. And that my defender and my protector was so strongly developed, and she developed really early in my life from having some of my more subtle vulnerable needs not having been met for so long, right? And I also learned that as a tool of getting my needs met from my mom, because that's what she learned. So I both developed it on my own, and I learned from observation, because she struggled. She didn't know how to get her needs met, so she would sort of wait and wait and wait and wait and wait, and then she'd get so overwhelmed that she would just kind of lose it. And that kind of became my methodology. But by the time I would lose it, I'd have so much would come out to my poor husband, who'd be like, where is all this coming from? Are you crazy? What's going on? And I'm like, I'm crazy. I've been feeling this for months. He's like, well, why didn't you say something? But it didn't even occur to me to say something, because my coping mechanism was stuff it, shove it up, be strong, be tough, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You're smart, you're capable. You don't need to do yoga, massages, time off. That's for the losers, and work. But no, no, it didn't work. And, I've done some things I'm not proud of, but I have done a lot of work on self compassion and accepting myself. And I'm not a perfect person. I still make mistakes. So I don't want anybody to think that, okay, I sometimes have clients ask me, well, how much more work do I have to do to get there? Like, when am I going to get there? And I'm like, oh, I mean, bad news. You don't really,
Takes time.
you don't fully kind of ever get there, because, as you work on yourself, we're still sort of a part of this world. We're still a part of this society. And there's still some unhealthy messages that are coming into your sphere from the culture, right? So even if you've worked out your childhood, first of all, you never really 100% work it out, because there's always going to be a little sensitive spots there, right? But then we're bombarded by these messages, right? And it's so hard. You have to sort of be conscious and aware and cultivate your own self-worth, so you don't end up kind of, falling into that trap.
Right. So I want to ask you this, um, because you've given so much good advice, and I want to kind of hone in on this. Like if someone's watching this and they are still struggling or on the fence with therapy
Mhm.
or talking to someone about their feelings, or having difficulty feeling their feelings, what advice would you give to them?
Well, the very first thing that I would say to do is honor the part that's hesitating to do that. You know, have compassion to the part that's scared to take that step. And rather than saying, well, why am I scared? My girlfriend's doing it and she's saying it's fine. And here I heard Jalen and Dr. Magid talking and they're saying it's so great. What the hell is wrong with me? Like, that's what we do. We just immediately, what the hell's wrong with me? That's okay. Book chapter, right? So let's have compassion and honor that, right? And it's very normal to be scared of therapy. This is the funny thing. I was already a therapist at that time, and I've been doing therapy for a few years already by then. And when I went to see my first therapist, I was so scared. I know. It's so funny. Like, I was mortified. And the whole time, now mind you, I've already been doing this, right? And I still was like a kid. The whole time I was thinking, like, oh my God, what if she judges me? Oh, I got something bad to tell her. She's going to think I'm so like angry and she's going to send me to like anger management classes, And one of the best things that my therapist gave me weren't any tools per se, but it's the gift of feeling accepted by another human being unconditionally, And so I would encourage you to look for a therapist who can do that for you, because tools are wonderful and they're very important. And I don't want to minimize, but you can read about tools online. You can read about them in a book, but a book cannot give you that acceptance. A book will never see you. A book will never say to you, hey, I know you did all these things, but I see you. I get why you did them. And that's like honey for the soul, right? That opens up that door for self-compassion. When she was able to do that for me and she wasn't mortified, I expected her face to be like, you did what now? You threw a shoe at your husband now? Well, I don't see clients like that now, okay? But she just sat there and nodded, she's like, okay, well, that makes sense, I was like, it does? Aren't they crazy? And through that, she just nodded and smiled and sort of accepted me, and nothing was too big a shock for her, and nothing was this outrageous, crazy thing. And that really, if I think back on it, was probably the first step, the first building block, and the most important thing that needed to happen to me is for someone to hear my whole truth, right? No lying, and somebody else accepted the whole me and wasn't mortified, nor did they call 911 to immediately hospitalize me. And they scheduled another session with me. And there was so much shame involved. Like, well, I'm a healer too. I'm a therapist. Like, I was afraid. She was like, and you see clients? Like, holy macro, right? Like, none of that. She was like, well, you're a human being, Viktoriya. What do you expect? I was like, I am? Oh, I didn't think about it that way, right? And so that's what I would say. First, have compassion for yourself. Fear is very normal. Revealing all of yourself to somebody is very scary, but it can also be the most powerful tool that you can get that only another human being can give you. And therapists are trained in being able to see past all of your.
Wow. That was so great. And I think you just made it so relatable, because we get scared and we don't have a background in therapy or a PhD. So for you to be able to share your experience, and that was your experience, I mean, anyone could listen to that and say, okay, well, if she can do it, I can do it. So thank you for that.
Yes, absolutely.
And thank you for this. It's been wonderful. I really appreciate your time, your knowledge, the way you delivered everything. It was really, 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 really amazing and powerful. And I think that anyone who listens to this will benefit. And even if it's just one person, we still did.
Yeah, yeah. And that's kind of how I think about it. And that's, I've been doing a little more on my platform recently just because the message is so important. It's so powerful, and it's about all of us. Nobody had a
Hmm.
perfect childhood. Trauma is on the continuum, I believe. We used to kind of think like, oh, trauma is when you feel like your life's in danger. Well, sometimes objectively that is certainly true. Certainly those things will be traumatic, but ask a 5-year-old what traumatizes them. You know, if a parent is screaming at them, they might feel like their life's in danger, even though the parent never said like, "Oh, I never meant to hurt them. I never touched them. I never." So it's the trauma is an experience, right? A trauma isn't what actually happens to you from an outside perspective. It's an experience. It's how you felt about the situation. And when that dawned on me, I realized that I had a lot of trauma in my childhood because I was scared a lot. And trauma can also be something that didn't happen. Like I was left alone a lot, for example. And that doesn't necessarily look like trauma, right? But I remember that dread. I remember the fear. So follow the fear, right? Follow the dread. And I think we can all relate to this. Again, like I said, trauma is in a continuum. Some people have very classic trauma, real true neglect, true abuse, true, sexual abuse. You know, and then, I was probably somewhere in the middle. And then there's folks who are maybe a little more on this spectrum where it's hard to identify and it may not be acute fear, but it's just kind of this perpetual feeling of not being seen. Maybe a parent with an unlived dream. A parent wanted me to be someone else. I have one client right now I'm working with, and she said one thing that really traumatized me is my mom wanted me to be a really girly girl. And my mom always dressed me with bows and pretty dresses, and it just wasn't me. I resented that. And when I would fight against that, my mother would fight me back, right? And so it's this perpetual chronic unacceptance of who I was that ended up giving me this feeling that something's wrong with me because my mother treated me that something's wrong with me because I want to be this way, because I want to wear pants and a baseball hat. That's not acceptable. That's not good enough. Right. And again, if it happens once or twice, you need to dress your kid for church. I mean, that's totally fine. We're talking about like a chronic 80% of the time, I don't accept this tendency, even though the tendency in and of itself is not healthy. And not unhealthy, right? It's not like your kid's doing drugs or something. The kid just wants to wear a certain thing or. So again, trauma is in a continuum, and I think we can all relate to various aspects of what you and I talked about today, and what you talk about in your other episodes. Frankly, it's not just for people with mental illness. It's for all of us. It's for all of us. We all are subject to some sort of adaptation from either our childhood or the culture at large. And the more time we spend in making the unconscious conscious, the less it's going to sort of rule our lives, right? That's Carl Jung sort of said that, right? We allow unconscious to rule our life, and we call it fate.
Mm. Wow. Wow. All right. Well, again, Dr. Magid, this has been amazing,
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Like I said, your energy, your delivery, just fantastic. If someone wants to look you up, where can they find you online or on social media?
So I'm on Instagram. I'm Dr. Magid, dot holistic psychologist. That's just because I use all the techniques and I believe in mind and body connection. And I have a website, www.viktoriyamagid.com. My first name spelled a little different, but you can figure it out. And I've started TikTok. I'm super new to it. I have a couple hundred followers. I just started that a couple months ago. So, you can look me up on TikTok as well. Trying to be hip.
Well, thank you. You are hip. You don't have to try. Well, again, thank you so much for this. Really enjoyable. Tons of great information, and you really showed your body of work. So thank you for who you are, what you do, the way you do it, and for your time.
Thank you. And thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you. I appreciate that.